Chairwoman. My friend, Mr. Westerman, just a couple quick questions. The ranking members talked about somehow this is good for, individuals who are, quote, polluters. I know at least one of the bills we're talking about is important with respect to the Duluth complex, right? And that would, it could constitute a sizable portion. I've got 88% down in my notes, but I know it's a very large percent of the cobalt reserves in the United States. Currently, we're highly dependent on China for cobalt, correct?
Very dependent on China for cobalt and many other minerals and rare earth elements.
And is it not true that the Biden administration, with its senseless, job-killing, hard-working American, life-destroying tailpipe rule that will stack up more mandates on electric vehicle production to the tune of something like 2/3 of the production by 2030, meanwhile EVs are piling up on the lots of automobile dealerships across the country, that in light of that even if one were to say that we should be moving towards electric vehicles, which I think is a reasonable question to debate in and of itself, would it not be foolish to do that on the back of Chinese production and Chinese cobalt mining?
I believe so, and I think you've done a great job of outlining what I would call Democrat utopia. We're going to have our cake and eat it too. We're going to get rid of fossil fuel. We're going to get rid of internal combustion engine vehicles. Everybody's going to drive an EV, and we're not going to mine anything to create the components that go into that EV, or to strengthening the grid, or to building wind and solar and more distributed electrical systems. And it just doesn't work that way. It's a not in my backyard mentality that is forcing our supply chains more and more to China, who has gone out and hoarded resources from around the world. Cobalt is one you mentioned that comes from the Congo, where
right.
they use child slave labor.
Child slave labor, right.
They haul it back to China, where they refine it. And by the way, China built 50 gigawatts of coal-powered plants last year. That's one every 5 days, so they can process the minerals and manufacture the stuff to sell to us so that we can save the planet. It makes absolutely no sense.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez, what do you say to that point, right? When we've got a significant amount of evidence that China owns the vast majority, if not all, 80% plus of the cobalt mine production coming out of Congo, et cetera. And we know, I think it's irrefuted, that there's child labor exploited to get those minerals. Those minerals are central, if not fully necessary, for the production of EVs, which even objectively we have to acknowledge are not fully able to power the ability of the American public to get to their jobs and their work and so forth. And yet we're mandating that we have 2/3 of the production be EVs by 2030. So if we follow those mandates by the Biden administration, that debate aside, right, debate for a different day, if you follow those mandates, you got to have a massive, massive amount of battery production. And by all indication, the vast majority of that Congo production is controlled by China. A huge amount of that has child labor and other issues that we've talked about, and you got trafficked child slaves that are reported in the production of it. Why on earth would we want to limit the ability of Americans to go mine cobalt? Now, I might say, well, that's kind of great because I actually still want the internal combustion engine. I actually think it's more affordable and better for the American worker who wants the plumber in San Marcos, Texas, to be able to go to work and afford the car. But if you buy into the motion of having, EVs that you can drive all over creation, even if you're from Texas and you had to do like I did, I appreciate the chairman pointing out the passing of my grandma. I had to drive 6 hours, like 300 miles to go see my grandma Thursday before she passed away, and 6 hours back. I couldn't do that at an EV. I wouldn't have been able to make the round trip in time. But okay, assume we were able to ever produce the batteries that last long enough, the charging stations, all the stuff. Why would we get rid of the American production of it?
Thank you. There are several different components to your question. I want to make sure that I address them. First and foremost, on the issue of child exploitation, child labor, I think it is the role of the United States for us to push back forcefully on this production, and not just in the production of energy, but across the board. We see this in textile production, energy production, cobalt mining. It is horrific, and we need to make sure that our sources do not include child labor. But to get to the core of the question, too, on the China front, is that I find it interesting that there is this concern about Chinese ownership of minerals, and it is legitimate. However, the response to that seems to be deregulation specifically for companies that are largely Chinese-owned here in the United States. These companies are subsidiaries where the benefit of what we are deregulating here, and I'll give you a specific example. I would be remiss not to mention that the minerals produced specifically at the proposed Twin Metals mine that is implicated in this legislation would most likely be shipped to China for refining and smelting to be sold on the global market. These are not American-owned companies that American mined minerals would be going to. And so if your concern is the Chinese predominance of ownership in the mining market, I would be very concerned about passing this legislation. So that, I think, on the China piece there. And lastly, on the meeting our targets and mining cobalt. I think it's a false choice to say that in order for us to mine cobalt, we either have to destroy some of the most sacred lands in the United States or rely on child labor. There's responsible mining in the United States that is available to us. But secondly, I also find it interesting that the majority presently pushes back against battery recycling, which would allow us to open the path to reducing our reliance on mining in general. There is enormous potential in recycling many of these EV batteries, but we have not made the investments or the shifts necessary in order to unlock that so that we can reduce our reliance on solely mining as the only source of battery. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Before I give my colleague a chance to respond, as I think he probably wishes to, I would only note that happy to have a conversation about restricting Chinese ownership of any number of corporate activities in the United States, or ownership of farmland, or ownership of land near military bases, or frankly, ownership of meat packing, production, including mineral production and so forth. A significant reason why it would be mined here and shipped back is because they've got all the production facilities, because they've been building and mining these, because they've got the resources to do that. And here we've got the God-given benefit in America being able to produce very clean burning natural gas, very efficient ability to have automobiles that have an internal combustion engine, which are basically fractionally about 1.5% of the CO2 production when you compare it to what we're producing in China, as the gentleman noted, where they've got 1,100 coal-fired plants burning in China, and we have 250, and they're building 2 a week, and we're building none. And yet we're building no nuclear plants except for the Georgia plant that was finally put online 45 years after it was permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think if we're going to be serious about it, we can't say, I just don't accept the premise that the sort of general notion of, well, we got to push back on the child labor. Well, I mean, we're going to use that child labor unless we find a supply right now, because the Biden administration has put their foot on the gas to say we must have EVs in 2030 at the extent of 2/3 of our entire production line. So Toyota is not a Chinese-owned company, but Toyota has a massive production facility in San Antonio, tells me that they will largely have to put their entire assembly line starting next year into EVs pretty much only, because they can't financially afford to do otherwise with these mandates on the tailpipe rule, which will be shutting down the internal combustion engine production of the Toyota vehicles. No Chinese ownership there, because that's where they are, which will then mandate the EVs, driving up the price of those vehicles, and then they got to go figure out how to get the batteries and get the production. I know the gentleman seemed like he wanted to jump in on that, and so I'd like to give him a chance to respond.
I appreciate the opportunity to respond. So many things to talk about here, and I agree with the assertion that we don't have the refining and the smelting capacity in the U.S., but that's self-imposed. You go back to 1995, we produced 3 times the copper of China and today they produce 11 times more copper than us. They have 50 smelters, and we have 2. That's another area of regulation that's forced business like that out of our country to China, and they're making the things that we need. We're exporting wealth to China to build these projects, and we have the resources that have made this country strong and that are still here to make us strong in the future if we will just use them.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman. I will, in the interest of time, yield back. I know there's other issues here. I would just push back on the general notion that these aren't important pieces of legislation. I mean, dealing with figuring out how we're going to protect our federal lands and the wildlife and the ability for hunters and anglers to use them, all that stuff are all part of this legislation, and we all share an interest in conservation in that respect. Look at Texas. We have very little federal ownership of the land, happily so. But where we have federal lands, we ought to try to manage it appropriately for good stewardship for multiple generations, including production and AMWR, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the footprint of the entire state of Alaska. Lots of studies about wildlife benefits and so forth. But we'll put that aside for a different day, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am very concerned that these bills are a huge step back for our environment and our endangered species. They seem to be predicated on a false kind of a binary choice. And I don't think it's true that President Biden or Democrats or the American people have any interest in having a blanket prohibition on development, but we do want a system that fairly takes into account public safety, conservation, and the damage to our environment and our children's future if we aren't taking those into consideration. So can you comment on that?
Absolutely, Representative Scanlon. As you noted, particularly in the public land rule, specifically, this shift in the rule is not even to put conservation and restoration above, energy production, recreation, or any other considerations. It's simply to allow the consideration to be on equal footing. And I would emphatically push back on the notion that conservation is just simply cordoning off, that this rule is just about conservation and cordoning off several acres of land and saying there's nothing to be done here. But this is also about land restoration. And there are so many acres of land, federal lands, public lands. This is land that belongs to the people of the United States of America, that has been dumped on, that has been allowed to be overridden with toxic waste, that people are getting sick from, that species are becoming endangered from. And to allow that to simply be in equal consideration as the federal government and the Bureau of Land Management doles out and makes decisions, oftentimes affirmatively about energy production, I think is eminently reasonable.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that we're trying to balance some competing concerns, but that we really do need to take into account these conservation concerns. So I would yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just be quick. I mean, I'm thankful for the legislation on that supports hunters and fishermen. I mean, I think, the more time a child spends